Hey there, everybody. It is 3 minutes to 9, and that means bedtime story time. So, we are reading Howl's Moving Castle. We are on chapter 13, and this is page 241 of 429. So, we are almost done, which means I have to read the next book a lot faster if I'm going to catch up. Alright, so with no further ado, unless Opal has something to say about it, Chapter 13, in which Sophie blackens Howl's name. Sophie was feeling decidedly queer again when she reached the palace. Its many golden domes dazzled her. The way to the front entrance was up a huge flight of steps with a soldier in scarlet standing guard every 6 steps. The poor boys must have been near fainting in the heat, Sophie thought, as she puffed her way dizzily up past them. At the top of the steps were archways, halls, corridors, lobbies, one after another. Sophie lost count of how many. At every archway, a splendidly dressed person wearing white gloves, still somehow white in spite of the heat, inquired their business, and then led them on to the next personage in the archway. "Mrs. Pendragon to see the king!" The voice of each echoed down the halls. About halfway, Howl was politely detached and told to wait. Michael and Sophie went on, being handed from person to person. They were taken upstairs, after which the splendid persons were dressed in blue instead of red and handed on again until they came to an anteroom paneled in 100 different colored woods. There, Michael was peeled off and made to wait too. Sophie, who was by this time not at all sure whether she was not having some strange dream, was ushered through through huge double doors, and this time the echoing voice said, "Your Majesty, here is Mrs. Pendragon to see you." And there was the king, not on a throne, but sitting in a rather square chair, with only a little gold leaf on it, near the middle of a large room, and dressed much more modestly than the persons who waited on him. He was quite alone, like an ordinary person. True, he sat with one leg thrust out in a kingly sort of manner, and he was handsome in a plump, slightly vague way, but to Sophie he seemed quite youthful and just a touch too proud of being a king. She felt, he thought, with that face, to have been more unsure of himself. He said, "Well, what does the wizard Howl's mother want to see me about?" And Sophie was suddenly overwhelmed by the fact that she was standing talking to the king. It was, she thought dizzily, as if if the man sitting there and the huge important thing which was kingship were two separate things that just happened to occupy the same chair. And she found that she had forgotten every word of the careful, delicate things Howl had told her to say. But she had to say something. "He sent me here to tell you he's not looking for your brother, your Majesty." She stared at the king, and the king stared back. It was a disaster. "Are you sure?" asked the king. "The wizard seemed quite willing when I talked to him." The one thing Sophie had left in her head was that she was here to blacken Howl's name, so she said, "He lied about that. He didn't want to annoy you. He's a slitherer outer, if you know what I mean, your Majesty." "And he just hopes to slither out of finding my brother Justin," said the king. "I see. Won't you sit down, since I see you are not young, and tell me the wizard's reasons?" There was another plain chair, rather a long way from the king. Sophie creaked herself down into it and sat there with her hands propped on her stick like Mrs. Pensman, hoping that would make her feel better. But her mind was simply a roaring white blank of stage fright. All she could think of to say was, "Well, only a coward would send his old mother along to plead for him. You can see what he's like just from that, your Majesty." "It is an unusual step," the king said gravely, "but I told him that I'd make it worth his while if he agreed." "Oh, he doesn't care about money," Sophie said, "but he's scared stiff of the Witch of the Waste, you see. She put a curse on him, and it's just caught up with him." "Then he has every reason to be scared," the king said with a slight shiver. "But tell me more, please, about the wizard." "More about Howl?" Sophie thought desperately. I have to blacken his name. Her mind was such a blank for a second that it actually seemed to her that Howl had no faults at all. How stupid. Well, he's fickle, careless, selfish, and hysterical, she said. Half the time I think he doesn't care what happens to anyone, as long as he's all right, but then I find out how awfully kind he's been to someone. Then I think he's kind just when it suits him, only then I find out he undercharges poor people. I don't know, your majesty, he's a mess. My impression, said the king, was that Howl is an unprincipled, slippery rogue with a glib tongue and a clever mind. Would you agree? Oh, how well you put it, Sophie said heartily. But you left out how vain he is, and she looked suspiciously at the king across the yards of carpet. He seemed so surprisingly ready to help her blacken Howl's name. The king was smiling. It was the slightly uncertain smile that went with the person he was, rather than the king he ought to be. Thank you, Mrs. Pendragon, he said. Your outspokenness has taken a weight off my mind. The wizard agreed to look for my brother so readily that I thought I'd picked the wrong man after all. I feared he was someone who was either unable to resist showing off, or would do anything for money. But you've shown me that he is just the man that I need. Oh, confound it, Sophie cried out. He sent me to tell you that he wasn't. And so you did. The king hitched his chair an inch toward Sophie's. Let me be equally outspoken now, he said. Mrs. Pendragon, I need my brother back, badly. It is not just that I am fond of him and regret the quarrel we had. It is not even that certain people are whispering that I did away with him myself, which anyone who knows us both knows to be perfect nonsense. No, Mrs. Pendragon, the fact is, my brother Justin is a brilliant general, and with High Norland and Strangia about to declare war on us, I can't do without him. The witch has threatened me too, you know. Now that all reports agree that Justin did indeed go into the waste, I am certain that the witch meant me to be without him when I needed him most. I think she took Wizard Suleiman as bait to fetch Justin, and it follows that I need a fairly clever and unscrupulous wizard to get him back. Howl will just run away, Sophie warned the king. No, I don't think he will. The fact that he sent you tells me that. He did it to show me that he was too much of a coward to care what I thought of him. Isn't that right, Mrs. Pendragon? Sophie nodded. She wished she could have remembered all of Howl's delicate remarks. The king would have understood them even if she did not. It's not the act of a vain man, the king said, but no one who would do that except as a last resort, which shows me that a wizard Howl will do what I want if I make it clear to him that his last resort has failed. I think you may be, taking delicate hints that aren't there, your majesty, Sophie said. I think not, the king smiled. His slightly vague features had all firmed up. He was sure he was right. Tell the wizard Howl, Mrs. Pendragon, that I am appointing him royal wizard as from now, with our royal command, to find Prince Justin alive or dead before the year is out. You have our leave to go now. He held out his hand to Sophie, just like Mrs. Pensman, but a little less royally. Sophie levered herself up, wondering if she was meant to kiss his hand or not. But since she felt more like raising her stick and beating the king over the head with it, she took the king's hand and gave a creaking little curtsy. It seemed to be the right thing to do. The king gave her a friendly smile as she hobbled away to the double doors. Oh, curses, she muttered to herself. It was not only exactly what Howl did not want. Howl would now move the castle 1,000 miles away. Letty, Martha, and Michael would all be miserable, and no doubt that there would be torrents of green slime into the bargain as well. It comes of being the eldest, she muttered while she was shoving the heavy doors open. You just can't win. And here was another thing which had gone wrong. In her annoyance and disappointment, Sophie had somehow come out through the wrong set of double doors. This anteroom had mirrors all round it. In them she could see her own little bent, hobbling shape in its fine grey dress, a great many people in blue court dress, others in suits as fine as Howl's, but no Michael. Michael, of course, was hanging around in the anteroom, panelled in 100 kinds of wood. Oh, drat, said Sophie. One of the courtiers hastened up to her and bowed. Madam Sorceress, can I be of assistance? He was an undersized young man, rather red-eyed. Sophie stared at him. "Oh, good gracious," she said. "So the spell worked." "It did indeed," said the small courtier in a little ruefully. "I disarmed him while he was sneezing, and he is now suing me, but the important thing," his face spread into a happy smile, "is that my dear Jane has come back to me. Now, what can I do for you? I feel responsible for your happiness." "I'm not sure that it mightn't be the other way around," Sophie said. "Are you by any chance the Count of Cataract?" "At your service," said the small courtier, bowing. Jane Ferrier must be a good foot taller than he is, Sophie thought. It is all definitely my fault. "Yes, you can help me," she said, and explained about Michael. The Count of Cataract assured her that Michael would be fetched and brought down to the entrance hall to meet her. It was no trouble at all. He took Sophie to a gloved attendant himself, and handed her over with much bowing and much smiling. Sophie was handed to another attendant, then another just as before, and eventually hobbled her way down to the stairs guarded by the soldiers. Michael was not there, nor was Howl, but that was small relief to Sophie. She thought she might have guessed it would be like this. The Count of Cataract was obviously a person who never got a thing right, and she was obviously another herself. It was probably lucky that she had even found the way out. By now she was so tired and hot and dejected that she decided not to wait for Michael. She wanted to sit down in the fireside chair and tell Calcifer the mess that she had made of things. She hobbled down the grand staircase. She hobbled down the grand avenue. She stumped along another where spires and towers and gilded roofs circled round in giddy profusion, and she realized it was worse than she had thought. She was lost. She had absolutely no idea how to find the disguised stable where the castle entrance was. She turned up another handsome thoroughfare at random, but she did not recognize that either. By now, she did not even know the way back to the palace. She tried asking the people she met. Most of them seemed as hot and tired as she was. "Wizard Pendragon," they said. "Who's he?" Sophie hobbled on hopelessly. She was near giving up and sitting on the next doorstep for the night when she passed the end of a narrow street where Mrs. Pensman's house was. "Oh," she thought, "I can go and ask the footman. He and Howl were so friendly that he must know where Howl lives." So she turned down the street. The Witch of the Waste was coming up it towards her. How Sophie recognized the witch would be hard to say. Her face was indifferent. Her hair, instead of being orderly chestnut curls, was a rippling mass of red, hanging almost to her waist, and she was dressed in floating flutters of auburn and pale yellow. Very cool and lovely she looked. Sophie knew her at once. She almost stopped, but not quite. There's no reason she would remember me, Sophie thought. I must be just one of hundreds of people she's enchanted, and Sophie stumped boldly on, thumping her stick on the cobbles and reminding herself in case of trouble that Mrs. Pensman had said the same stick had become a powerful object. That was another mistake. The witch came floating up the little street, smiling, twirling her parasol, followed by two sulky-looking page boys in orange velvet. When she came level with Sophie, she stopped, and tawny perfume filled Sophie's nose. "Why, it's Miss Hatter," the witch said, laughing. "I never forget a face, particularly if I've made it myself. What are you doing up here, dressed up all so fine? If you're thinking of calling on that Mrs. Pensman, you can save yourself the trouble. The old biddy's dead." "Dead?" said Sophie. She had a silly impulse to add, "But she was alive an hour ago," and she stopped herself because death is like that. People are alive until they die. People are alive until they die. "Yes, dead," said the witch. "She refused to tell me where someone I was that I want to find. She said, 'Over my dead body,' so I took her at her word." She's looking for Howl, Sophie thought. Now what do I do? If she had not been so very hot and tired, Sophie would have been almost too scared to think. For a witch who could kill Mrs. Pensman would have no trouble with Sophie, stick or no stick. And if she suspected for a moment that Sophie knew where Howl was, that could be the end of Sophie. Perhaps it was just as well that Sophie could not remember where the castle entrance was. "I don't know who this person is that you've killed," she said, "but that makes you a wicked murderess." But the witch did not seem to suspect anyway. She said, "But I thought you said you were going to call on Mrs. Pensman." "No," said Sophie. It was you who said that. I don't have to know her to call you wicked for killing her. Well, then where are you going? Said the witch. Sophie was tempted to tell the witch to mind her own business, but that was asking for trouble. So she said the only other thing she could think of. I'm going to see the king, she said. The witch laughed disbelievingly. But will the king see you? Yes, of course, Sophie declared, trembling in error and anger. I made an appointment. I'm going to petition him for better conditions for hatters. I keep going, you see, even after what you did to me. Well, then you're going in the wrong direction, said the witch. The palace is behind you. Oh, is it? Said Sophie. She did not have to pretend to be surprised. I must have got turned around. It's been a little vague. I've been a little vague about directions ever since you made me like this. The witch laughed heartily and did not believe a word of it. Then come with me, she said, and I'll show you the way to the palace. There seemed nothing Sophie could do but turn round and stump beside the witch, with the two page boys trudging sullenly behind them both. Anger and hopelessness settled over Sophie. She looked at the witch floating gracefully beside her and remembered Mrs. Pensman had said that the witch was an old woman, really. It's not fair, Sophie thought, but there was nothing she could do about it. Why did you make me like this? She demanded, as they went up the grand thoroughfare with a fountain at the top of it. You were preventing me getting some information that I needed, the witch said. I got it in the end, of course. Sophie was quite mystified by this. She was wondering whether it would do any good to say there must be some mistake, when the witch added, though I dare say you had no idea that you were, and laughed, as if that was the funniest part of it. Have you heard of a land called Wales? She asked. No, said Sophie. Is it under the sea? The witch found this funnier than ever. Oh, not at the moment, she said. It's where the wizard Howl comes from. You know Wizard Howl, don't you? Only by hearsay, Sophie lied. He eats girls. He is as wicked as you are. But she felt rather cold. It did not seem to be due to the fountain that they were passing at that moment. Beyond the fountain, across a pink marble plaza, were the stone stairs with the palace at the top. There you are. There's the palace, said the witch. Are you sure you can manage all those stairs? None the better for you, said Sophie. Make me young again, I'll run up them, even in this heat. Oh, that wouldn't be half so funny, said the witch. Up you go, and if you do persuade the king to see you, remind him that his grandfather sent me to the waste, and I bear him a grudge for that. Sophie looked hopelessly up the long flight of stairs. At least there was nobody but soldiers on them. With the luck she was having today, it would not have surprised her to find Michael and Howl on their way down. And since the witch was obviously going to stand there and make sure she went up, Sophie had no choice but to climb them. Up she hobbled past the sweating soldiers, all the way to the palace entrance again, hating the witch more with every single step. She turned around, panting at the top. The witch was still there, floating russet shape at the foot, with two small orange figures beside her, waiting to see her thrown out of the palace. Oh, drat her, said Sophie. She hobbled over to the guards at the archway. She had bad luck, her bad luck still held. There was no sign of Michael, nor of Howl in the reaches beyond. She was forced to say to the guards, There was something I forgot to tell the king. They remembered her, and they led her inside to be received by a personage with white gloves. And before Sophie had collected her wits, the palace machinery was in motion again, and she was being handed from person to person just like the first time until she arrived at the same double doors and the same person in blue was announcing, Mrs. Pendragon, to see you again, your majesty. It was like a bad dream, Sophie thought as she went into the same large room. She seemed to have no choice but to blacken Howl's name again. The trouble was that with all that had happened, and the stage fright again into the bargain, her mind was blanker than ever. The king, this time, was standing at a large desk in one corner, rather anxiously moving flags about on a map. He looked up and said pleasantly, They tell me you have something you forgot to say. Yes, said Sophie. Howl says he'll only look for Prince Dustin if you promise him your daughter's hand in marriage. What put that into her head? Well, he'll have us both executed. The king gave her a concerned look. Mrs. Pendragon, you must know that's quite out of the question. But I can see that you are very worried about your son to suggest it. You can't keep him tied to your apron strings forever, you know. And my mind is made up. Please, come and sit in this chair. You seem tired. Sophie tottered over to the low chair the king pointed to and sank into it, wondering when the guards would arrive to arrest her. The king looked vaguely around. My daughter was here just now, he said. To Sophie's considerable surprise, he bent down and looked under the desk. Valeria, he called. Vally, come on out. This way, there's a good girl. And there was a shuffling noise. After a second, Princess Valeria shunted herself out from under the desk in a sitting position, grinning benignly. She had 4 teeth, but she was not old enough to have grown a proper head of hair. All she had was a ring of wispy whiteness over her ears. When she saw Sophie, she grinned yet wider and reached out with the hand that she had been sucking on and took a hold of Sophie's dress. Sophie's dress responded with a spreading wet stain as the princess hauled herself to her feet on it. Standing up into Sophie's face, Valeria addressed a friendly remark to her in what was clearly a private and foreign language. Oh, said Sophie, feeling an awful fool. I understand how a parent feels, Mrs. Pendragon, said the king. Chapter 14, in which a royal wizard catches a cold. Sophie rode back to the castle's Kingsbury entrance in one of the king's coaches, drawn by 4 horses. On it also were a coachman, a groom, and a footman. A sergeant and 6 royal troopers went with it to guard it. The reason was Princess Valeria. She had climbed into Sophie's lap. As the coach clattered the short way downhill, Sophie's dress was still covered with the wet marks of Valeria's royal approval. Sophie smiled a little. She thought Martha might have a point after all, wanting children, although 10 Valerias struck her as a bit much. As Valeria had scrambled over to her, Sophie remembered hearing that the witch had threatened Valeria in some way, and she found herself saying to Valeria, The witch shan't hurt you. I won't let her. And that is very brave of any Sophie, I'm sure. The king had not said anything about that, but he had ordered out a royal coach for Sophie. The equipage drew to a very noisy halt outside the disguised stable. Michael shot out of the door and got in the way of the footman who was helping Sophie down. Where'd you get off to? He said. I've been so worried, and Howl's terribly upset. I'm sure he is, Sophie said apprehensively. Because Mrs. Pensman is dead, said Michael. Howl came to the door, too. He looked pale and depressed. He was holding a scroll with a red and blue royal seals dangling off of it, which Sophie eyed guiltily. Howl gave the sergeant a gold piece and did not say a word until the coach and the troopers had gone clattering away. Then he said, I make that 4 horses and 10 men just to get rid of some old woman. What did you do to the king? Sophie followed Howl and Michael indoors, expecting to find the room covered in green slime, but it was not, and there was Calcifer flaring up the chimney, grinning his purple grin. Sophie sank into the chair. I think the king got sick of me turning up and blackening your name. I went twice, she said. Everything went wrong, and I met the witch on the way from killing Mrs. Pensman. Oh, what a day. While Sophie described some of what had happened, Howl leaned on the mantelpiece, dangling the scroll as if he were thinking of feeding it to Calcifer. Behold the new royal wizard, he said. My name is indeed very black. Then he began to laugh, much to the surprise of Sophie and Michael. And what did she do to the Count Cataract? I should never have let her near the king. I did blacken your name, Sophie protested. I know, it was my miscalculation, Howl said. Now how am I going to go to poor Mrs. Pensman's funeral without the witch knowing? Any ideas, Calcifer? It was clear that Howl was far more upset about Mrs. Pensman than anything else. Michael was the one who worried about the witch. He confessed next morning that he had had nightmares all night. He had dreamt that she came through all of the castle's entrances at once. Where's Howl? He asked anxiously. Howl had gone out very early, leaving the bathroom full of the usual scented steam. He'd not taken his guitar, and the doorknob was turned to green down. Even Calcifer knew no more than that. "Don't open the door to anyone," Calcifer said. "The witch knows all about all of the entrances except the Porthaven one." This so alarmed Michael that he fetched some planks from the yard and wedged them crosswise over the door. Then he got to work, at last, on the spell that they had got back from Mrs. Angorian. Half an hour later, the doorknob turned sharply to black down. The door began to bounce about. Michael clutched at Sophie. "Don't be afraid," he said shakily. "I'll keep you safe." The door bounced powerfully for a while. Then it stopped. Michael had just let go of Sophie in great relief when there came a violent explosion. The planks clattered to the floor. Calcifer plunged to the bottom of the grate, and Michael plunged in the broom cupboard, leaving Sophie standing there as the door burst open and Howl stormed in. "This is a bit much, Sophie," he said. "I do live here." He was soaking wet. The gray and scarlet suit was black and brown. His sleeves and the ends of his hair were dripping. Sophie looked at the doorknob, still turned to black down. Miss Angorian, she thought. And he went to see her in that charmed suit. "Where have you been?" he said. Howl sneezed. "I've been standing in the rain. None of your business," he said hoarsely. "What were those planks made of?" "I did them," said Michael, edging out of the broom cupboard. "The witch." "You must know I don't know my business," Howl said irritably. "I have so many misdirection spells out that most people wouldn't find us at all. I give even the witch 3 days. Calcifer, I need a hot drink." Calcifer had been climbing up among his logs, but as Howl went over to the fireplace, he plunged it down again. "Don't come near me like that! You're wet!" he hissed. "Sophie," Howl said pleadingly. Sophie folded her arms pitilessly. "What about Letty?" she said. "I'm soaked through," said Howl. "I should have a hot drink." "And I said, what about Letty Hatter?" Sophie said. "Bother you, Dad." He shook himself. The water fell off him in a neat ring on the floor. Howl stepped out of it with his hair gleaming dry and his suit gray and scarlet and not even damp. And he went to fetch the saucepan. "The world is full of hard-hearted women, Michael," he said. "I can name 3 without stopping to think." "One of them being Miss Angorian?" asked Sophie. Howl did not answer. He ignored Sophie grandly for the rest of the morning, while he discussed moving the castle with Michael and Calcifer. Howl really was going to run away, just as she had warned the king that he would, Sophie thought, as she sat and sewed more triangles of blue and silver suit together. She knew that she must get Howl out of that gray and scarlet suit as soon as possible. "I don't think we need to move the Porthaven entrance," Howl said. He conjured himself a handkerchief out of the air and blew his nose with a hoot which made Calcifer flicker uneasily. "But I want the moving castle well away from anywhere it's been before, and the Kingsbury entrance shut down." Someone knocked on the door then. Sophie noticed that Howl jumped and looked round as nervously as Michael. Neither of them answered the door. "Coward," thought Sophie scornfully. She wondered why she had gone through all of the trouble for Howl yesterday. "I must have been mad," she muttered to the blue and silver suit. "Are you eating more tissue box?" "Ah, no, you are eating mail. Makes you want to wag your tail and eat mail." She is judging me because she's trying to figure out whether or not she did anything bad. Nephew. I know, it's almost bedtime. Listen. Do your thing. "What about the Black Down entrance?" Michael asked when the person knocking seemed to have gone away. "That stays," Howl said, and conjured himself another handkerchief with a final sort of flick. It would, Sophie thought. Miss Angorian is outside it, poor Letty. By the middle of the morning, Howl was conjuring handkerchiefs in 2s and 3s. They were floppy squares of paper, really, Sophie saw. He kept sneezing. His voice grew hoarser. He was conjuring handkerchiefs by the half-dozen soon. Ashes from the used ones were piled all around Calcifer. "Why is it that every time I go to Wales, I always come back with a cold?" Howl croaked, and conjured himself a whole wad of tissues. Sophie snorted. "Did you say something?" Howl croaked. "No, but I was thinking that people who run away from everything deserve every cold that they get," Sophie said. "People who are appointed to do something by the king and go courting in the rain instead have only themselves to blame." "You don't know everything I do, Mrs. Moralizer," Howl said. "Want me to write out a list before I go out another time? I have looked for Prince Justin. Courting isn't the only thing I do when I go out." "Where have you looked?" said Sophie. "Oh, how your ears flap and your long nose twitches," Howl croaked. "I looked when he first did appear, of course. I was curious to know what Prince Justin was doing up this way, which everyone else knew. Suleiman had got into the waist. I think someone must have sold him a dud finding spell, because he went right over to Folding Valley and brought another one from Mrs. Fairfax, and that fetched him right back this way fairly naturally, where he stopped at the castle, and Michael sold him another finding spell and a disguise spell." Michael's hand went to his mouth. "Was that man in the green uniform Prince Justin?" "Yes, but I didn't mention the matter before," said Howl, "because the king might have thought you should have had the sense to sell him another dud. I had a conscience about it. Conscience. Notice that word, Mrs. Longnose. I had a conscience." Howl conjured another wad of handkerchiefs and glowered at Sophie over them, out of eyes that were now red-rimmed and watery. Then he stood up. "I feel ill," he announced. "I am going to bed, where I may die." He tottered piteously to the stairs. Bury me beside Mrs. Pensman," he croaked as he went up to bed. Sophie applied herself to her sewing harder than ever. Here was her chance to get the gray and scarlet suit off of Howl before it did more damage to Miss Angorian's heart. Unless, of course, Howl went to bed in his clothes, which she did not put past him. So Howl must have been looking for Prince Justin when he went to Upper Folding and met Letty. Oh, poor Letty, Sophie thought, putting brisk, tiny stitches round her 57th blue triangle. Only another 40 or so to go. Howl's voice was presently heard, shouting weakly, "Help me, someone! I'm dying from neglect up here." Sophie snorted. Michael left off working on his new spell and ran up and down the stairs. Things became very restless. In the time it took Sophie to sew 10 more blue triangles, Michael ran upstairs with lemon and honey, with a particular book, with cough mixture, with a spoon to take the cough mixture with, and then with nose drops, throat pastilles, gargle, pen, paper, 3 more books, and an infusion of willow bark. People kept knocking at the doors, too, making Sophie jump and Calcifer flicker uneasily. When no one opened the door, some of the people went on hammering for 5 minutes or so, rightly thinking that they were being ignored. By this time, Sophie was becoming worried about the blue and silver suit. It was getting smaller and smaller. One cannot sew in that number of triangles without taking up quite a lot of cloth in the seams. "Michael," she said when Michael came rushing downstairs because Howl fancied a bacon sandwich for lunch. "Michael, is there a way of making small clothes larger?" "Oh, yes," said Michael. "That's just what my new spell is, when I get the chance to work on it. He wants 6 slices of bacon in the sandwich. Could you ask Calcifer?" Sophie and Calcifer exchanged speaking looks. "I don't think he's dying," Calcifer said. "I'll give you the rinds to eat if you bend. I'll give you I'll give you the rinds to eat if you bend your head down," Sophie said, laying down her sewing. It was easier to bribe Calcifer than to bully him. They had bacon sandwiches for lunch, but Michael had to rush upstairs in the middle of eating his. He came down with the news that Howl wanted him to go into market shipping now to get some things he needed for moving the castle. "But the witch, is it safe?" Sophie asked. Michael licked bacon grease off of his fingers and dove into the broom cupboard. He came out with one of the dusty velvet cloaks slung round his shoulders. At last, the person who came out, wearing the cloak, was a burly man with a red beard. This person licked his fingers and said with Michael's voice, "Howl thinks I'll be safe enough like this. It's misdirection as well as disguise. I wonder if Letty will know me." The burly man opened the door, greened down, and jumped down into the slowly moving hills. Peace descended. Calcifer settled and chinked. Howl had evidently realized that Sophie was not going to run about after him. There was silence upstairs. Sophie got up and cautiously hobbled to the broom cupboard. This was her chance to go now and see Letty. Letty must be miserable by now. Sophie was fairly sure that Howl had not been near her since that day in the orchard. It might just do some good if Sophie were to tell her that her feelings were caused by a charmed suit. Anyway, she owed it to Letty to tell her. The 7-league boots were not in the cupboard. Sophie could not believe it at first. She turned everything out, and there was nothing there but ordinary buckets, brooms, and the other velvet cloak. "Oh, drat the man!" Sophie exclaimed. Howl had obviously made sure that she would not follow him anywhere again. She was putting everything back into the cupboard when someone knocked at the door. Sophie, as usual, jumped and hoped that they would go away, but this person seemed more determined than most. Whoever it was went on knocking, or perhaps hurling him or herself at the door, for the sound was a steady whump, 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 more than proper knocking. After 5 minutes, they were still doing it. Sophie looked at the uneasy green flickers which were all she could see about Calcifer. "Is it the witch?" "No," said Calcifer, muffled among his logs. "It's the castle door. Someone must be running alongside us. He's going quite fast." "Is it the scarecrow?" Sophie asked, and her chest gave a tremor of the mere idea. "It's flesh and blood," Calcifer said. His blue face climbed up into the chimney, looking puzzled. "I'm not sure what it is, except that it wants to come in badly. I don't think it means any harm." Since the whump, whump just kept going on, giving Sophie an irritable feeling of urgency, she decided to open the door and put a stop to it. Besides, she was curious about what it was. She still had the second velvet cloak in her hand from turning out the broom cupboard, so she threw it around her shoulders as she went to the door. Calcifer stared. Then, for the first time since she had known him, he bent his head down involuntarily. Great cackles of laughter came from under the curly green flames. Wondering what the cloak had turned her into, Sophie opened the door. A huge, spindly greyhound leapt off the hillside between the grinding black blocks of the castle and landed in the middle of the room. Sophie dropped the cloak and backed away hurriedly. She had always been nervous of dogs, and greyhounds were not reassuring to look at. This one put itself between her and the door and stared at her. Sophie looked longingly at the wheeling rocks and the heather outside, and wondered whether it would do any good to yell for Howl. The dog bent its already bent back, and somehow hoisted itself onto its lean hind legs. That made it almost as tall as Sophie. It held its front legs stiffly out and heaved upwards again. Then, as Sophie had her mouth open to yell to Howl, the creature put out what was obviously an enormous effort and surged upward into the shape of a man in a crumpled brown suit. He had gingerish hair and a pale, unhappy face. "Came from upper folding," panted this dog-man. "Love, Letty sent me. Letty crying, very unhappy. Sent me to you. Told me to stay." He began to double up and shrink before he had finished speaking. He gave a dog howl of despair and annoyance. "Don't tell, wizard!" He whined and dwindled away inside reddish curly hair into a dog again, a different dog. This time he seemed to be a red setter. The red setter waved its fringed tail and stared earnestly at Sophie from melting, miserable eyes, as if to ask for cheese or maybe homemade hamburger. She's not paying attention, so she doesn't know I'm making fun of her. "Oh dear," said Sophie as she shut the door. "You do have troubles, my friend. You were that collie dog, weren't you? Now I see what Mrs. Fairfax was talking about. That witch wants slaying. She really does. But why has Letty sent you here if you don't want me to tell the wizard Howl?" The dog growled faintly at the name, but it also wagged its tail and stared appealingly. "Because dogs are wonderful." "All right, I won't tell him," Sophie promised. The dog seemed reassured. He trotted to the hearth, where he gave Calcifer a somewhat wary look, and lay down beside the fender in a skinny red bundle. Calcifer, what do you think? Sophie said. And I'm sorry, I seem to have lost the little old lady voice, because I think this is the most that I have read for the bedtime story kick contiguously at once. So maybe I shouldn't read tomorrow. This dog is a bespelled human, Calcifer said unnecessarily. I know, but what can you take the spell off of him? Sophie asked. She supposed Letty must have heard, like so many people, that Howl had a witch working for him now, and it seemed rather important to turn the dog into a man again and send him back to upper folding before Howl got out of bed and found him here. No, I need to be linked with Howl for that, Calcifer said. Well, then I'll try it myself, Sophie said. Poor Letty, breaking her heart for Howl and her only other lover, a dog most of the time. Sophie laid her hand on the dog's soft, rounded head. Turn back into the man you should be, she said, and said it quite often, but its only effect seemed to be to send the dog deeply to sleep. It snored and twitched against Sophie's legs, like a good pupper. Meanwhile, a certain amount of moaning and groaning was coming from upstairs. Moaning and groaning. That's not whining. This is whining. Sophie kept muttering to the dog and ignored it. A loud, hollow coughing followed, dying away into more moaning. Sophie ignored that, too. Crashing sneezes followed the coughing, each one rattling the window and all the doors. Sophie found those harder to ignore, but she managed. Went a blown nose, like a bassoon in a tunnel. The coughing started again, mingled with moans. Sneezes with the moans and the coughs, and the sounds rose to a crescendo in which Howl seemed to be managing to cough, groan, blow his nose, sneeze, and wail, gently, all at the same time. The doors rattled, the beams in the ceiling shook, and one of Calcifer's logs rolled off onto the hearth. All right, I get the message, Sophie said, dumping the log back into the grate. It'll be green slime next. Calcifer, make sure that dog stays where he is. And she climbed the stairs, muttering loudly, Really, these wizards, you'd think that no one had ever had a cold before. Well, what is it? She asked, hobbling through the bedroom door into the filthy carpet. I'm dying of boredom, Howl said pathetically. Or maybe I'm just dying. He was lying, propped on the dirty gray pillows, looking quite poorly, with what might have been a patchwork coverlet to cover him, except that it was all one color with dust. The spiders he seemed to like so much were spinning busily in the canopy above him. Sophie felt his forehead. You do have a bit of a fever, she admitted. I'm delirious, said Howl. Spots are crawling before my eyes. Those are spiders, said Sophie. Why can't you cure yourself with a spell? Because there is no cure for a cold, Howl said dolefully. Things are going round and round in my head, or maybe my head is going round and round in things. I keep thinking of the terms of the witch's curse. I hadn't realized that she could lay me bare like that. It's a bad thing to be laid bare, though the things that are true so far are all my own doing. I keep waiting for the rest to happen. Sophie thought back to the puzzling verse. What things? Tell me where all past years are. Oh, I don't that, said Howl. My own, or anyone else's, they're all there, just where they always were. I could go and play bad fairy at my own christening if I wanted to. Maybe I did, and that's my trouble. No, there are only 3 things I'm waiting for. The mermaids, the mandrake root, and the wind to advance an honest mind. And whether I get white hairs, I suppose I'm not going to take the spell off to see. There's only about 3 weeks left for them to come true in. And the witch gets me as soon as they do, but the rugby club reunion is Midsummer's Eve, and I shall have to go to that at least. The rest had all happened long ago. You mean the falling star and that never being able to find someone true and fair? Said Sophie. I'm not surprised the way you go on. Mrs. Pensman told me you were going to the bad. She's right, wasn't she? I must go to the funeral even if it kills me, Howl said sadly. Mrs. Pensman always thought too well of me. I blinded her with my charm. Water ran out of his eyes. Sophie had no idea if he was really crying or whether it was simply his cold, but she noticed that he was slithering out again. I was talking about the way you keep dropping ladies as soon as you've made them love you, she said. Why do you do it? Howl pointed a shaky hand up towards the canopy of his bed. That's why I love spiders. If at first you don't succeed, try again. I keep crying, he said with great sadness. But I brought it on myself by making a bargain some years ago, and I know I shall never be able to love anyone properly now. The water running out of Howl's eyes was definitely tears now. Sophie was concerned. Oh, no, you mustn't cry. There was a pattering outside. Sophie looked round to see the dogman oozing himself past the door in a neat half circle. She reached out and caught a handful of his red coat, thinking that he was certainly coming to bite Howl. But all the dog did was lean against her legs, so that she had to stagger back to the peeling wall. What's this? Said Howl. My new dog, Sophie said, hanging on to its curly hair. Now she was against the wall. She could see out of the bedroom window. It ought to have looked out into the yard, but instead it showed a view of a neat, square garden with a child's metal swing in the middle. The setting sun was firing raindrops, hanging on the swing to blue to red. As Sophie stood and stared, Howl's niece, Mary, came running across the wet grass, and Howl's sister Megan followed Mary. She was evidently shouting that Mary should not sit on the wet swing, but no sound seemed to come through. Is that the place called Wales? Sophie asked. Howl laughed and pounded on the coverlet. Dust climbed like smoke. Bother that dog, he croaked. I had a bet on with myself that I could keep you from stooping out the window all the time you were in here. Did you know? Said Sophie, and she let go of the dog, hoping he would bite Howl hard. But the dog only went on leaning on her, shoving her towards the door now. So all that song and dance was just a game, was it? I might have known. Howl lay back on his gray pillows, looking wronged and injured. Sometimes, he said reproachfully, you sound just like Megan. Sometimes, Sophie answered, shooing the dog out of the room in front of her. I understand how Megan got the way that she is. And she shut the door on the spiders, the dust, the garden, with a loud bang. So, I think I should probably take tomorrow off, let my voice recover, because I have 140 some pages left, 145 pages left, and I need to be at my best to be able to give you good and comfy sleeps. So, get some rest and do your best to become somebody that you can be proud of. And remember that if people can hate without knowing a thing about you, then I can love you. Sleep well, dear.